Welcome back. Day one here at the Thompson Broadcast Studio in NAB. We are thrilled to be joined right now by Robert McDowell, former FCC Commissioner. Thank you so much for joining us here in studio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be at NAB and see it so vibrant.
Right, I know. I mean, it's been years now since
Exactly.
we've been in person. It kind of feels like we're back.
We are back. A lot of energy here, which is wonderful to see.
And talk to us, even through the pandemic, we have seen a lot of growth in the broadcast sector.
Absolutely. So, first of all, local broadcasters were so crucial to surviving this pandemic or thriving throughout it even. So I just saw the current chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, speak a few minutes ago, and she emphasized that point, which is that critical local news and information was gathered by broadcasters, local broadcasters. In many cases, they are the only news gatherers in their markets, in the medium and smaller markets, where there are no newspapers. Large national tech companies are not gathering local news, and that was so important for local school district measures regarding the pandemic or whatever the case might be. So I think more and more people were paying attention to their local broadcasters during the pandemic, and that became a crucial part of the nation's fabric of our infrastructure to help us get through it. So it was wonderful to see. And in the meantime, there's been a lot of activity in the broadcast space, M&A activity, a lot of investment in broadcasting by private equity and others. So that tells me that the markets are bullish on broadcasting right now.
And do you foresee expansion continuing in the sector, not only in the United States, but globally?
Absolutely. So in the United States and in other countries too, but there are sort of three business models. How do broadcasters get paid? One is certainly advertising. That's the tried and true way. The other in the US has been subscription based. So whether cable or satellite, direct broadcast satellite companies paying broadcasters to carry their signals. That's a form of subscription. And the third that is opened up in recent years is the idea of broadcasters being able to monetize their spectrum. Their spectrum in the US under the 1 gigahertz range, not to get too much in the weeds, travels a long distance and carries a lot of data with it. So technology, brilliant engineers have been able to develop technologies like ATSC 3.0, which helps interleave that one-to-many traditional television signal with a two-way IP-based or internet protocol-based signal for terrestrial mobile broadband or fixed broadband if you wanted it to be. And that is opening up a whole new frontier for broadcasters to monetize their spectrum in addition to their content.
And do you see that also improving viewers' interactivity rates with that technology?
Absolutely. Really, the sky's the limit. So you could have interactive viewer experiences or user experiences. It could be related to the content being streamed by the local broadcaster. You could have sort of mobile broadband uses and applications that we can't even imagine today as a result of that. So it's really a whole new world, and we're only limited by the scope of our imaginations.
And what is the state of connectivity in the United States post-COVID?
So as we've all found that spectrum in general was crucial to us surviving COVID. We've seen investment in 5G really start to accelerate. We have perhaps about $300 billion in private risk capital being invested to build out 5G networks. So that's separate and apart from what broadcasters might be doing with ATSC 3.0, for instance. That spectrum, those wireless signals have to be backhauled by things like fiber, so there's been a lot of investment in fiber as well. And as we saw with last year's infrastructure spending bill, there will be about $65 billion more in infrastructure for broadband spent. So that's going to help the entire ecosystem. Broadcasters are an important part of that ecosystem because they are licensees of some of the best, what we used to call beachfront spectrum, so the most desirable spectrum. Again, because the types of frequencies they use those signals can travel long distances and can penetrate buildings, unlike some higher frequencies which have different propagation characteristics.
And you're just talking about that, the infrastructure bill and how it funded the broadband expansion. So that expansion, and particularly the funded by that infrastructure bill, how is that going to change the landscape and change the media world as in general?
So again, we have about $300 billion in private risk capital being spent. Add on top of that the $65 billion from that bill. Add on top of that about $9 billion a year that the FCC spends through something called its Universal Service Program, and other things as well. And there are other broadband grants that have been happening for years. So tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and that is at all levels. So that's fiber, it's wireless, it's coaxial cable, it's satellite as well, so satellite broadband as well. And all of that is coming together to serve consumers. So we can't imagine what the 5G world is really going to bring us just yet. So I was at the FCC when we were laying the foundation for 4G, and among the best and the brightest out there, nobody really foresaw the app economy and things of that nature that 4G brought us. We knew there would be some great things coming, we just didn't know what it was. And I think we're going to see that with 5G. You're going to have a lot of problems solved, like such as latency, meaning the speed of communications, and that's going to help with robotics. If you think of a warehouse managing the warehouse's inventory, or if you think of the type of haptics, which is how does something feel, that's going to help surgery. You can have remote surgery or remote medicine in general, and 5G is going to revolutionize a lot of that. And of course, there's always the talk of autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, which I think is a little bit farther away, but certainly wireless-enabled cars are a thing of the present, not just a thing of the future. So bottom line is we can't even imagine the sort of untold benefits of what all this is going to bring, and broadcasters can be part of that.
And telemedicine, you mentioned the medical field, but the broadband expansion into telemedicine, and then also something that we didn't even really think about that much before the pandemic, but remote learning.
Absolutely, right. It's an excellent point. So, what's really important is to make sure that lower income Americans, talking just about America, have access to laptops and tablets and connectivity as well, right? So that's been one of the big challenges. But what we've seen is kind of a revolution that was accelerated by the pandemic. As tragic as it was, it did accelerate the adoption of technologies and the spending needed to show people you can have remote learning, you can have telemedicine, these things. You can also work from home and spend more time with your family or exercising or all the above, right? So be more efficient. And bosses have learned that in some cases, not for everybody, if you're a surgeon it's harder, if you're a waiter it's harder, but those are personal services, businesses, you have to be there in person. But bosses have learned for accountants and bookkeepers and things like that, or lawyers, that you don't have to be physically present all the time to get the work done. And actually, in many professions, efficiency has increased. And I can't imagine how we would have faced this pandemic, let's say 20 years ago, 1992, let's say. That was 30 years ago, holy smokes. Then, time's flown.
Really
My math is off, that was a quick 30 years. Let's say even 2002, in a 3G world, I can't imagine how we would have faced this pandemic. And so mobile broadband, fixed broadband, and broadcasting have all sort of come together to really help us survive it. And it's something to be noted and studied. Hopefully years from now, we will be able to kind of look back and really understand how did we do it, and what can we learn from that to make the world better in the future.
And we always knew about the digital divide for years. We've known it exists, but especially during the pandemic when we went virtual for so many schools across the country, it really kind of shone a light and just how big of a gap there is when families, underserved communities don't have that access, especially when their children were relying on it for education, right?
Absolutely. And so, first of all, the FCC's $9 billion a year Universal Service Program is supposed to focus on those communities that don't have broadband first and foremost. So it could be rural, it could be inner city, lower income, it could be a lot of different constituencies, rural, lower income. Then the broadband spending bill, the infrastructure spending bill itself, also looked at that, right? So you have some states don't have that capability. Larger, better funded states like California and New York already have that, but Wyoming, which only has 475,000 people in the whole state, doesn't have something like that, for instance, right? So they're gonna have to set up those offices. Towns and localities, towns, cities, counties, et cetera, will apply for funds, as well as private sector entities in those states as well. And so that'll be part of a collaborative process that started with Congress, goes to the Department of Commerce, FCC has an advisory role, and then down to the state capitals, down to the very local level. And so it'll be, there are a lot of steps from here to there before we get to success, but it'll hopefully have a very beneficial effect.
Mm-hmm. We'll be looking and watching for that. So what's next for the television and telecom convergence? Is that fueled by 5G?
It absolutely is. So I remember when I was a young associate in 1992, 30 years ago, at a law firm, I had this, cathode ray tube monitor that was amber, and big desktop box, and a keyboard, and it looked like a television to me. And I remember saying to a partner at the law firm at the time, I'm wondering when that cathode ray tube, monitor will become my television set. And he sort of laughed at me and said, that's never going to become your television set. And so here we are. Not that I was any kind of visionary. I was like, it's a TV set.
Did you call him and tell him?
Yeah, I should. I should do that. He's still around. I should do that. So here we are. With mobile screens, people watching the content of their choice, where and when they want to watch it, and there is a convergence. The important thing for broadcasters is to get paid, local broadcasters, to get paid for their content. And so back to the notion of local journalism, that local news gathering, that's critical information. It could be a pandemic, it could be tornadoes bearing down on your town, or hurricanes coming, but local viewers need that information, and national operations, tech companies, et cetera, aren't gathering that local news and disseminating it. So how do we sustain local journalism, that critical information gathering? And that's going to be a big question. It's a big question now. I've got some ideas for the FCC already, but we've got to sustain that because there's no other business model out there. So it's great if we can watch the local broadcaster's weather report on our phones, and it might be cached or stored, pre-recorded, and you're watching what was broadcast 30 minutes prior or whatever, or it could be in real time based on their websites. But that costs them money to produce that. It costs money to invest in the radar, to invest in the analysis, and the graphics, and everything else that goes out for the end user consumer to see. And so as we see tech companies taking the vast lion's share of local ad revenue, and that's through competition, which is fine, there has to be a way to make sure local broadcasters, local content creators are adequately compensated for that content. Otherwise, we're going to see potentially local broadcasting go the way of local newspapers. Both my parents are journalists, so I have a bias there, but go the way of local newspapers, and there are almost no local newspapers in mid-sized and small markets anymore. It's a thing of the past. There are national newspapers, which are doing fine, but the local newspapers are gone. So we don't want broadcasters to go the way of the dinosaur, right? So policymakers such as Chairwoman Rosenworcel and Congress and others are going to have to figure out what can they do to modernize rules to make sure that we still have local broadcasting, local news gathering. So that convergence is a great thing, right? At the same time, but with that disruption is disrupting the revenue flow in order to support these critical functions.
Well, and we've also seen with the advancement of technology, people given a megaphone to spread disinformation, and protecting those local broadcasters, especially during those life-saving events that you mentioned, severe weather, pandemic, things like that, is crucial.
You're absolutely right. There's a Pew Foundation, which is a nonpartisan research foundation that has a number of studies showing that local broadcast journalism is the most trusted journalism. more so than the national broadcast networks, more so than the cable networks, and more so than the tech companies. And that tells you something. So that's the marketplace speaking. Those are consumers speaking to us, and having that credibility there, and also local accountability, right? If you lose your accountability locally, you're going to lose your viewership, you're going to lose your economic sustainability, you're going to go out of business, right? So there's a free market incentive to be credible and to have good, verified information. Again, my parents were journalists. They went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism.
Me too.
Yes, I saw that. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Thank you, I appreciate the shout out.
World War II era, they were. And the notion of triple sourcing and all that, sometimes I wonder, is that still there in journalism? 3 independent sources to verify things before you tweet it out, right? And it can't all just be clickbait that's not credible. So you're absolutely right. This is a big question before us, and hopefully the marketplace will help provide some sort of economic pressure that values credible journalism over misinformation.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your expertise, decades of expertise and your foreshadowing. You saw the technology coming 30 years ago.
By dumb luck. It's a stupid question at the time, but anyway, it turned out to be something.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great honor.
Yes. Many more interviews to come right here at NAB in the Thompson Broadcast Studio.